Greetings, everyone, and for the Christian viewers, especially Orthodox, Christ is risen. It's my pleasure to salute Bernie Lewin.
Hi, Doru.
Hey, Bernie. From Melbourne. He's a philosopher and a historian of science. Before little, I'll invite him to say a few things about himself. But not before showing to our viewers, as my custom goes. I know some of them are annoyed because of these introductions, but anyway, I try to maintain a certain approach. I believe in personalizing the message. Bernie is the founder of the Platonic Academy of Melbourne, which is something exciting if you think of it, the 21st century, while in the academia you see the humanities being smashed and cracked and dismantled and so on and so forth, there is a sense of a need of the wisdom of past ages, that wisdom that is foundational for our culture, especially in this case for the European kind of culture. And it has been with great joy that I discovered Bernie's Platonic Academy. A Platonic Academy, and he'll tell us more about it. So there's a website there. You can take courses, those of you who are interested, but I'll let Bernie to speak of it more. This is just to point out the fact that, okay, so Amazon gives me more. These are two of his books, Enthusiastic Mathematics, which is Platonic mathematics, of course, and an older book on climate change with a German translation. So there you go. For those of you who read German, and if you can't find the English version, feel free to access that version on Amazon. And I found also an article on arithmetic and its geometry in the higher degrees of laws of form, which is, of course, a journal article where we see the more sophisticated approach of Bernie to Platonism. And on this note, thanking you once again for gracing us with your presence. I assume that the readers, the reviewers, the viewers will be as thrilled to listen to our conversation as I am. Bernie, please tell us something about yourself, a few things about yourself and the Academy.
Oh, thank you, Doru. You did some research. That's very nice. We hadn't talked about some of those publications. The main publication relevant to us today, I suppose, is Enthusiastic Mathematics, and also some of the publication, the journal articles, and a book chapter that's coming out soon about Platonic mathematics. So thank you so much for that. I also have done some history of science in climate science as well. But yeah, so I've actually been interested in Plato and Platonism since my days at in postgrad. I did start a PhD, but that didn't go so well. And I've really road to Damascus experience at that time. And that was actually through someone who wasn't, wasn't Platonist when he wrote his great work, which is George Spencer Brown, who wrote a book called Laws of Form, which I connect with in that article that you pointed out. And actually, after he wrote the book, he realized that he was really connecting with Platonism. And so for me, Platonism and science go together. I mean, you know, you tend to have your philosophy and your religion perhaps separate from your science. And for me, well, if they're true, then, you know, they should be connected. And so just briefly about the Platonic Academy, we set that up a few years ago because we felt that in the universities these days, especially to undergraduates, Plato and Platonism isn't being taught very well. It's kind of like a caricature of Platonism, whereas we take our Platonism very seriously. And from perhaps the university point of view, we're quite extreme, quite radical. We take the allegory of the cave, which people might know, seriously, that sensible objects are mere shadows of their formal essences. So it's very anti-materialist, if you want to see it from that point of view, which is kind of hard to come to when you get a bunch of students coming in at university, I guess, and they're doing all their other Enlightenment philosophy, Kant and Locke and all that stuff these days. And then there's this radical position which Plato takes, which is in a very different direction. So we set up the academy. We wanted to get people reading Plato, helping them through the reading. That's mostly what we do. But we also do some different things. So we read the dialogues, and we also do some different things, though. We teach geometry, because for Plato and Platonism, geometry is very important. In the academy, in Plato's academy back in the 4th century BC, that was what they did. They did geometric and mathematical research. And so maybe we can get into a little bit later why that is important. But the other thing we've been doing is connecting with Christian Platonism and connecting with the relationship between Christianity and Platonism. And that has got a lot of interest. People are coming to the courses and people are going, wow, I had no idea. Now, for you Orthodox folks, maybe that's not so surprising, but in the Western Church, with that kind of big cutoff linguistically with the Latin and the Roman Church, and tending to go back to the Latin being very important, and in many other ways as well, this disconnect from the Greek roots, linguistically, Hellenistic culture, and all that sort of thing. So when we talk about, we go through from Hellenized Judaism, early Christianity, looking at Paul's letters, and we go right through we go through the Christian fathers, origin in the Christian fathers in Alexandria in particular, and show the relationships between the two, and see how perhaps you might say Christianity borrowed from Platonism or incorporated it. I mean,
that's how I prefer to put it. It's more a matter of continuity rather than borrowing something that didn't belong.
Exactly. And I mean, that's how St. Augustine saw it. I mean, I don't know whether people have read his marvelous Confessions, but he went from his Manichaeism to his Platonism. And then when he had his conversion, he didn't see any need to throw out any of the wisdom that he got through the Platonism. It was just the new revelation, revelation of the risen Christ, and very much as it's put in Paul's letters. And so these Christians did see it in that way, see that continuity. And so because of because of this interest, one of my students who has some connection with your organization, which is called ISCAS, yeah, right, Christians in Science and Technology, got me onto you and got me onto your organization. And I tell you, talking to people in the Orthodox Church, the whole talking about philosophy is so different from my experience growing up in the Catholic Church, because there just wasn't that discussion that I saw anywhere at all. And so that I was suggested to get in contact with you. And what I was saying to him and what I was saying to you, Dory, when we spoke earlier, was that there's another way to approach this relationship between Christianity and science. Because if you go right back, from my point of view, when Western science, when European science began with Platonism, or with the early philosophers at least, and then particularly with Platonism, and that's where we've seen it with the Pythagoreans and with Plato, with his academy. When that first began, that whole approach to knowledge that began at that time, science, philosophy, and religion were one. It was silly to separate them. And so actually what has interested me in my research, in my earlier research, I've gone away from it a bit, is what happened? Why was there this divide? You know, why do we now have this thing where we need to say, oh, well, they come together? You know, why do we go to church on Sundays and we hear all this thing? And then we go to school or whatever and do our science. So why was this separation? And the history of why it occurred and how it occurred is very interesting for me. It's a political story, it's a religious story, but it's also a story about philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and politics.
And should I understand, sorry to interrupt you, should I understand that the people taking courses at the academy are given this broader backdrop so that they can locate the significance of Platonism within this broader context where they should understand the implications of the Platonic paradigm in contrast to, say, other ways of thinking. I ask out of interest because when you said you teach geometry, well, I think that's where you got another student. I'm interested.
Yeah. Well, Dory, yeah, that's right. We actually do hands-on geometry. We get the compass and the straight edge and your paper. That's all you've got. And we do 6 weeks. And each week we draw a cryptic quote from one of the dialogues where Plato is describing in a rather cryptic way a particular piece of geometry. And we use that to then develop to draw that and then to draw around it and see what the philosophical significance of it is. And in terms of your question about showing students this, certainly we do show them how with Platonism, well, I mean, if you see on our website, our subtitle is Mysticism and Science, right? Platonism is a mystical religion or philosophy. Platonism.
Well, it ended up as a religion, at least in its Proclean iteration in the 5th century or so.
Certainly, with the Neoplatonists, with Plotinus and Proclus, that's right. It had a lot of the trappings of that you would normally associate with religion, including rituals and things like that. But so did the early Pythagoreans, of course. You know, they were more like the Orphic mysteries. So yeah, it's a mysticism in the sense of that the mystical source, the divine, if you like, the source of all of our experience and all of our knowing, and and the being in the world is unseeable, unknowable, universal, timeless, and ever present, yet ever present. Kind of feels like a contradiction, doesn't it? Ever present in the world, expressed in the world in every way. So that's Platonism, and that connects very strongly with certain types of Christianity, not the type of Christianity that I grew up with, actually, but the Christianity that I have now discovered when you go in and look at the mystical tradition within Christianity. You look at the early church fathers, and you look particularly at the Orthodox tradition more so than where it broke in the West, and especially what happened in the Western Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember the shock that I had as an undergrad in the early 90s when I stumbled on a book by Father Andrew Louth, who's an Orthodox archpriest who for many years taught early Christian studies and patristics at Durham University. I think this was his doctoral thesis transformed into a book, speaking of the origins of Christian mysticism, and it started with Plato. So no wonder that there's a different kind of approach to understanding the Christian faith, the Christian way of thinking, when you begin or you frame your entire tradition against the backdrop of Platonism, which makes our discussion very interesting. I'm certain, not only for potential students of your academy, but also for people who are actually interested in understanding the sources of their own tradition. I mean, particularly Orthodox Christians, but also, of course, people who are interested in making sense of why the world, our world, modern world, has evolved as it did, and what has this to do, for example, with the fact that at some point in late Middle Ages, the West has replaced the Platonic paradigm by the Aristotelian one, if my understanding is correct anyway.
Yeah, something along those lines. And I think your surprise when you were there at Durham University, which must be a pretty good center. I always hear of good stuff coming out of Durham on these topics. Must be a center for it. But
well, unfortunately, I studied in Bucharest, but we had libraries still.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the fact that it was a surprise to you is part of the story. The fact that it's a surprise to me is part of the story. That there's reasons to make this break, and those reasons were largely political, I think. Yeah.
Okay,
so
well, yeah. Well, keep going, please. Sorry, I have to shut up from time to time because there's some noise coming from outside. Well, please, when you see me just looking at you, encouraging you, keep going. So yeah, that's this is something that indeed not many people think about. The fact that we are the product of a certain evolution, a cultural evolution, of course, especially in Europe, in 2,000 years of cultural development, and that if we think in a certain way today, including in matters of faith and science, that's pretty much conditioned by developments, let's call them, in the second half of this be my millennial history. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I suppose the story of this separation really begins where there was no separation. So we're talking about that where there was no separation in early philosophy between what we might say theology, philosophy and religion. You know, we think of those as three different things, right? It's hard to really think of them as three different things back in that time. So you have the time of Plato, and then you have that Hellenistic period. To just give a little picture of that. So you had the conquest of Alexander the Great, and significantly the defeat of the Persian Empire, and then you get this huge area where all these traditions, like some very ancient traditions, are all mixing up, including in Egypt, including in Babylon, or whatever you want to call it, between the Tigris and Euphrates, and including the Jews. So you have this all mixing up, and in the Greek language. And you have various schools like that developed even at that time. An important one for Christians is the Stoics. For me, it's important the connection between the Stoics on certain teachings and Platonism. Stoicism and Platonism had a strong interaction early on. But my bias is Platonism, I suppose. My bias is philosophy. And so you had these schools running in the Christian period. Like now, thank God, scholars now call it late antiquity, but you used to call it, used to be called the early Christian period. And they tend to call it late antiquity now for a good reason, because philosophy was thriving and philosophy was mostly peaceful with Christianity and interacting in Christianity in many ways. Like in Alexandria, you had the patriarch Origen, who went to the same Neoplatonist school as Plotinus, you know. So that's quite amazing. And then you get this sense even over in the East with the schools in Athens, that Christian parents from wealthy families would send their sons off to Athens to get educated in philosophy. So you had this peaceful relationship between the two to a certain extent. You certainly had some persecution and so on in terms of political authority, but in terms of wisdom, the perennial wisdom, you know, you had this good, strong interaction. So there was that. And then I mentioned Augustine is quite late, and, you know, he had the conversion, and he says, well, I don't have to, you know, this wisdom that I've got through Plato, that there's nothing wrong about it. I'm just adding the extra, the new good news, the gospel, the resurrection, the revelations of the resurrected Christ. So strong relationship there.
I think, so to interrupt you again, I think for many early Christian theologians, or Christians of late antiquity, if you prefer, there was this idea that makes a lot of sense, that you cannot dissociate your Christian convictions from the culture of the time. The way, for instance, well, let's be very realistic. We're in Australia. I try to speak your language. Okay, I don't know how good I am at it, but anyway, I try to speak your language, which means what? I have to translate my entire universe, cultural, spiritual, emotional, whatever you want to call it, into the categories and the cultural references of this language, of this place, of this time. There's nothing preventing me from doing so. And I hit the drum here for my fellow Orthodox who believe that when they come to Australia, or they go to Western Europe or elsewhere, they should bring together with them all their cultural baggage. which makes them somehow intermediary beings, neither here nor there, you know. That's actually what happens to many migrants. But I think in terms of our faith, if we look back in time at those early Christian centuries, we realize that there was a lot of wisdom and balance there. They understood that that was the culture of their age and their place. Why should anyone speak, I don't know, Mandarin in 3rd century Alexandria when there's no Mandarin speaking community there? Same here. Platonism was the language of Alexandria. It was the language of education. Many later Christian theologians were steeped in Platonism, and they rejoiced in the subtlety of Platonic philosophy, to the extent that they have incorporated, alongside scriptural material in their own discourse, they have incorporated all sorts of Platonic references. If anyone reads, and I finish here, if anyone reads the famous theological orations of Saint Gregory the Theologian, known erroneously as Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory of Nazianzus is his father.
Right.
Yeah, he was never Bishop of Nazianzus.
Yeah.
Anyway, I keep saying this, but no one believes me. Anyway, yeah.
I know there were 2 Gregorys. Yeah.
Yeah, his father was Gregory of Nazianzus, but he wasn't a theologian, not to the extent that we can call him a church father. His son.
Can I just interrupt,
Yep.
Deru? We have a student in our class who has ancestral claims to Gregory the Theologian.
Really?
So,
Wow.
yeah, that's right. So her family looks after his tomb or something. You can, I can get you, I can get you onto it. So don't worry, I don't make the. I'm not allowed to. I'm not allowed to get them confused.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Well, that's awesome. So the family survives. Wow.
Apparently, that's their claim.
That's amazing. Anyway, yeah, so Gregory the Theologian, also known as Gregory of Constantinople, because that was his appointment as a bishop, in his theological orations incorporated a lot of Platonic material, ideas, but also phraseology. And this is something that many early Christian theologians did, weaving together philosophical cultural references and scriptural cultural references. There was no divide there. So I go with you. I hear you, and I believe that we have a very wrong representation of how things must have been there. And you know, they have Hellenized the gospel. Well, of course they have Hellenized the gospel, because when I come from Romania to Australia, I have to Australianize my Romanian mindset.
Yes. So yeah, everything has its cultural context. That's right, and its language and so on. And if you're a migrant, and unlike a lot of Australians, you need to speak 2 or 3 languages or whatever, you become a bit more aware of that, I think. So, of course, Gregory came, interestingly, after the Council of Nicaea, when you know, the Roman the center of the Roman Empire was moved to Constantinople, and unfortunately it split. It slowly started splitting, so we got the East and West. But Gregory came after that, and he was schooled in Athens in philosophy. So and that was, you know, perfectly fine. But so that was in the 4th century. Now in the 5th century, things weren't going so well politically, and by the early 6th century, the schools were closed down, and you get this strong exclusivist Christianity emerging, saying, well, we just want a Christian society, and that's where you start getting the problems. Of course, Islam emerged, and then you start getting waves of this anti-Jewish, anti-Islam, and so on, saying, you know, but of course, the important thing in our story is that the schools, the philosophy schools, were closed down. And so as some of our people with the Greek language might know, the word that we now use, heresy, eresis, comes from eresis, which is really just saying the teaching of the schools of philosophy. And so a lot of the works are lost. The old philosophy works are lost because they were either neglected or suppressed. So what also happened, of course, was in the West, was this kind of collapse of Roman civilization. So you had the Greek thing, and then when the Roman Empire emerged, the lingua franca for a lot of this intellectual stuff, even over into the West, going right over to Ireland, actually. That's part of our story too. When you think of John Scotus, he could read. He was from Ireland, and he could in the 9th century translated Pseudo-Dionysius, and he was from Ireland because they were still teaching Greek over there. So Greek spread right across the Roman Empire as well. Then you got this exclusivism, but you also got the demise of the Western Roman Empire with the sacking of Rome and the collapse of some of the big institutions and the trade and everything. And you got what we call the Dark Ages. And so, so to a certain extent, they were dark in terms of knowledge and everything. You got cut off from the texts and all that sort of thing. So that then changed. We had this wealthier period called the High Middle Ages, and we got the universities set up. And so people then wanted to redevelop the whole knowledge thing, right? So that was in the first universities were in 11th century, and so 12th century. And this is a period in philosophy that we often call scholasticism. Okay, in the West, it's called scholasticism. Now, what emerged then was the acceptance, mostly through the Arabs through various translations from Cyrillic and so on, of Aristotelian science in a particular form. Okay, so it was in this form, which was strangely, I'll call it atheistic or agnostic. And so you get people like famously Thomas Aquinas working out a deal so that we could have science so it wouldn't challenge religion. Now, the way I see this is that Platonism and Christianity were very close. Platonism and Neoplatonism has a theology, a theory of God. You know, when I say that in the narrow sense, a theory of God, of the divine creator. And so if you introduce Platonism or Neoplatonism into this environment, then you threaten the dogma of the church. And you threaten it politically as well, because the politics of the time was you control the religion, you control the dogma, you control the morality, you can keep it all under control. If you introduce something like Platonism or Neoplatonism, you challenge the authority. What is the nature of God? And so you have these things about the whole Trinitarian dispute, which people might know about. And then the Trinity teaching was put down in a dogma. And every time it was challenged, it was a huge problem. And it caused the church a lot of problems, the Trinitarian dogma. Let's just call it the theology of the creator, the theology. So with especially Thomas Aquinas has got some beautiful writings where he makes this very clear. He separates theology, revealed religion, from natural theology or natural religion. So revelation and reason. Okay, so you've got this division between revelation and reason. So one of the arguments he would say is that reason can discover a lot of things, but it can't discover the nature of the divine creator. So you can have these two separate domains. And this was, at this time, an Aristotelian idea where you study the creature rather than the creator. So God's already created the natural world, the material world, the world so in Aristotle, rather than having only forms, Plato's forms, everything comes from the unseen forms and originally from the creator. In Aristotelianism says, no, you've got to have matter and form, and when form is applied to matter. So you have this material world, and some ways to portray Aristotelianism in contrast with Platonism. And you, by the way, you see this in a famous painting in the Vatican by Raphael, with Plato pointing up and Aristotle kind of pointing down. And it's not bad symbolism, actually. Aristotle starts with, in this Christian Aristotelian, with all the creatures. So we can go and study all the creatures. We can classify them. Aristotle was great with classification. But anywhere where Aristotle started talking about God and the creator, like, for example, that there was no creation, actually, that was Aristotle's view, and various other, they were just shut out. So you had this Aristotelianism studying creation. It was atheistic. It didn't say anything about God. Okay.
That's very, very interesting, because it's a very different story, actually, from the destiny of Aristotelianism in the Byzantine era, where you have a similar process happening that unfolded earlier in relation to Platonism and its various schools, a Christianization of Aristotelianism. So it's really different. Thank you very much for sharing this. I mean, I didn't realize that that was what actually happened in scholasticism, making room for reason / Aristotle in order to decipher the mysteries of nature, of the creation, but let theology do its stuff in regard to God. While in Byzantine Aristotelianism, you have a theological reinterpretation of Aristotle, to the extent that the late Byzantine theologians, 13th, 14th century, especially 14th century, they are heavily Aristotelian, and marginalize the Platonists, a process that actually started in the 11th century with the school of Michael Psellos, who was a Neoplatonist, a mystical Neoplatonist more than a Christian. But slowly, Platonists began to be outcast, while the mainstream Byzantine theology of later centuries is very Aristotelian in its outlook, in its terminology and ideology.
So the theology was, the theology was Aristotelian.
Yeah.
Are you saying?
Yes.
And so didn't that challenge the Christian, teachings, the Christian dogma?
Not at all, because, as I said, the process started actually quite early. We see signs of Christian Aristotelianism already with the Cappadocians, with the famous distinction essence energy, which harkens back to Aristotle's ontology, and slowly this has become the norm. I think the major blow to pure Platonism came in the 7th century with Maximus the Confessor, who is the first major, let's call it, theoretician of the essence energy distinction. And after him, especially Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, canonized Aristotelian ontology. But as I said, given the earlier efforts that led to a radical theological reinterpretation of Aristotelianism. So it's a very different story, which is why perhaps the Byzantines did not come to a clash with rational thinking. They were more upset with the extreme mysticism of the likes of Michael Psellos, and perhaps later with Georgios Gemistos Platon, who had to actually to migrate to Italy, and they rolled the Platonist ball in Italy, in the Renaissance.
That's not a bad segue there, Doru. Not a bad segue at all to the Renaissance. Yes. No, look, that is that's very interesting what you're saying about Aristotelianization of theology in the Byzantine tradition. Yeah, and I think it is a different story, and I'd love to talk to you more about that, because very much, I mean, there was some of the language of the theology. It did go Aristotelian, definitely. And where do you draw the distinction with all this stuff about universals? We had this big dispute in scholasticism about the status of universals. I think that was a little bit also in the Byzantine as well, where nominalism and realism and so on, it's kind of like realism of the universals, like of qualities or something, was kind of getting close to Plato's forms. And people sometimes these days in the university still see Platonism as kind of like being medieval realism in terms of those forms. And so that was, the language there was all Platonist, Aristotelian. But I really feel that Platonism and Neoplatonism were, too dangerous, too hot to handle, because it was really important. The Neoplatonic one, Plato's form of the good, or from the Republic, or whatever else you want to call it. But anyway, so then what happened was the Renaissance. Now there's a leader. I should talk about something, that there was a minor tradition before the Renaissance where science and theology were one. And it tends to be associated with St. Augustine, an Augustinian tradition. So referring back to him, referring back to his Platonism, and very clearly, and from Paul, really, from where science and religion and theology, science and theology are one. And the big figure in this tradition, who was very powerful and then influenced the Renaissance, was this a Spanish thinker called Ramon Lull. I hope I pronounced that right. There's so many different pronunciations of him. So if the surname is usually spelt in English Lull, or some people say Lully, because there's a bit of a turn on with the double L at the end. So Ramon Lull. And he was a contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas. So I was mentioning earlier St. Thomas Aquinas, who made this separation, kind of made this piece. We can do science because it doesn't affect the theology, right? But Ramon Lull and the Lullian tradition said, no, it's all one, and had this notion of a tree of knowledge coming out of the divine source. So he was in southern Spain. He was mixing with the Moors, with the Islamic tradition. He could speak Arabic, and some very interesting interactions went on there. But he would influence, he had this idea of a great art, ars magna in the Latin, the great art, and this was the pursuit of this universal knowledge, which had no separation. So you had that minor tradition, but it was a minor tradition. In scholasticism, it was all, in the universities, it was mostly this Aristotle, and then you could do your theology. So then in the Renaissance, so we have we have Plato coming over, but what actually was happening was that in the 1400s, the early 1400s, 1438, I think, they decided, oh, well, things are getting pretty desperate over in Constantinople. The noose is slowly getting closer and closer to Constantinople by the Turks. And, the Eastern Church, the Eastern civilization is in big trouble. So there was this movement for unification, as you probably know about. And perhaps our listeners do too, but there was this move for unification in, as we know now, the last days of Constantinople. And with this, we're doing a course in our right at the moment in the Platonic Academy on Nicholas of Cusa, very interesting figure. So he was also a great diplomat for the Western Church. He was very close to the Pope, and he went with a delegation to Constantinople and picked up a few Greek texts while he was there as well, and met some interesting people, and then came back. And also some Byzantine Greek speakers came back and started teaching the Greek language and brought back the Greek, the philosophy, brought back complete works of Plato, Platonism, Corpus Hermetica, all these Neoplatonist Hellenistic texts. But importantly for us, I suppose, brought back the complete works of Plato, and famously, finally, a chap called Ficino translated them all, and the printing press was invented, and they got published. So you get in this, there was a bit that happened before that, and Nicholas of Cusa was part of that because he was before the printing press and before this translation of the complete works. He had bits and pieces. But anyway, it happened. We get Leonardo da Vinci, we get all these figures, we get Raphael, all these people get caught up in the Florentine Renaissance, get interested in science, mathematical science, mathematics and forms, Plato, the mathematics is the form of the world, and the divine one that is the source of all mathematics is the Christian God, is identified with the Christian God. So this emanationism of everything, and you can connect with it through your science. So it comes back together. Science and theology come back together. Extremely threatening for the church. And once again, you get a lot of problems about theology. You get rumors that Platon is actually had renounced Christianity. I'm not sure whether that's true, and that he'd become like a Neoplatonist and so on. So you get all these problems. Science is trying to emerge. The scientists are getting persecuted for being heretics. Okay, so that's what happened in the Renaissance, the revival of Platonism. And it didn't last forever. Should I take a break there? Is there anything you wanted to ask about that?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say a few things, but the noise grows. Yeah, it's terrible. So this is a very interesting context, and thank you for depicting it in such a great detail. So you have these conflicting views, especially having to do with, say, rigid theology on the one hand, on the other hand, philosophical influences. You would say, at least that's how I hear you. I'd say that the scholastic tradition, with its neat divide between reason, Aristotelianism, science on the one hand, and theology on the other hand, would favor a peaceful, amicable relationship between the emergent sciences and theology. On the other hand, you have this dangerous idea, the Platonic idea, that integrates things from a Platonic viewpoint harmoniously, of course, where there's no divide between reason and faith, between science and mysticism. You see these different positions. On the one hand, out of scholasticism comes a science that becomes more and more independent because it didn't have a theological backdrop anyway. On the other hand, you have this kind of Platonizing science of the Renaissance that brings with it the occult and all sorts of other things, down to Newton, who was a famous occultist. interested in the corpus hermeticus and so on and so forth. These different positions somehow made the church aware of the fact that there are cultural influences whose impact can no longer be neglected, ignored. And is this how you would explain why mainstream theology and the officialdom of the church would intervene in the destinies of the emergent science to stop something? But is that, and I'm trying to think aloud, is that because of the dangerous return of Platonism, or is it because of noticing more and more autonomy on the part of the scientists by virtue of the tradition of scholasticism?
I'm not sure it's by virtue of the tradition of scholasticism. In scholasticism, to a large extent, there was a peace. The scholastics fought about nominalism and realism, you know, all that sort of thing. But there to a large extent, you could do your Aristotelian science, right, without in your universities, and have all your debates about, you know, your rational debates, and do your logic, and maybe even do a little bit of mathematics, although not very much. But that was separate from the very important sacred things that needed to be protected. The other thing to mention about Platonism and what was going on, what emerged in the Renaissance, is what was also threatening right through the Middle Ages in mystical heresies. So if you go and look at the history of heresy in the West, you know, we get it documented by the Inquisitions and trials, or maybe even by what was screamed out just as someone was being burned at the stake. But what it often is declarations that my God is not the God that's written on the skins of animals. That religion is the dead letter. My God is within. So there's this religion that says that this religion of enthusiasm and theos, God within, it became a term of derision later in our story. So Plato talks about this in a big way, and you also see it in the early church with the Pentecostal moments where you're filled with God, right? Fire representing it and that sort of thing. So the God is within. You don't need the church authority. You don't need the priest. You don't need to get everything through the political powers of the state religion. So the God is within, and so that's threatening as well. So you're threatening the theology, you're also threatening the political authority, the spiritual authority of the state church. So there were lots of ways in which, I don't know whether people know, what was Bruno's first name? Some of these were, and
Giordano Bruno.
Yeah, Giordano Bruno, and many Renaissance figures who did great things in early science. I haven't got their names off the top of my head now, but their lives ended very badly. Bruno burned at the stake, and others were run out of town, and their lives ended very badly. So science, for a number of different reasons, was threatening. What's interesting for me is I think Platonism is, you know, the best philosophy of science. It's the one that gives the best account of science. Why doesn't it prevail? You know, I need to explain why it doesn't prevail. And
well,
so
that's quite interesting, because this should be the climax of our conversation and your pitch on behalf of the Academy. So why would we need Platonism today, apart from the subtleties of thought and thinking in terms of our being and so on and so forth? Why would we need it in our current conversations between, say, people of faith and people of science? What would Platonism bring at the table?
Well, there's a lot of problems in science that haven't been resolved. Well, there's some major elementary problems in science that haven't, and the foundations of science that haven't been resolved. And two of them I will just mention that are important for me is the foundation of mathematics, right? And so that's where I'm working at, and the relationship between logic and mathematics. So you will have 150 years ago, this huge controversy began about the foundations of mathematics between, can we give it logical foundations? Or so we might look at Bertrand Russell, might be a figure you might have heard of, who attempted to do that. And then so that you can reduce all mathematics to logic, and then to see how mathematics is all connected, perhaps connected through and unified through a notion of unity, a notion of oneness. And I think that needs to happen. And I think people who say it doesn't happen, it can't happen, probably saying it because they can't do it. And I think you can do that in Platonism, and that's, you know, you put up an article that I've published there, and that's an attempt to start doing that. That it's not the Platonism, if anyone's listening here and knows Gödel and you know, think, oh, Kurt Gödel, he's a Platonist. He's not a Platonist. He's a Kantian, actually. But it's going that way. It's an emanationism. Mathematics does have to start from something very elementary and get complex. So the foundations of mathematics was disputed for 50 years, and then the dispute just collapsed and we all forgot about it. Basically, the reduction of mathematics to logic failed, and there was derision towards the intuitivists, and then the Second World War came and we all forgot all about it. We got the atomic bomb and so on, so it was all okay. So there's that. And then there's the problem of epistemology, which I might just briefly say, if anyone knows Bishop Berkeley's criticism of John Locke, okay, then you know what I'm talking about. But it goes something like this: all I experience is my experience, right? So everything I experience is my experience. So how can I know something that's not my experience? If I think I know something that's not my experience, well, it's also my experience, isn't it? So how can you make the leap to the material external world? And so Descartes, Locke, Kant, the phenomenologists attempted to solve this problem. So Plato goes in a completely different direction, goes inward. So at the foundations of science, there are these problems, they're philosophical problems that haven't been resolved. They are resolved in Platonism, in my view. And so Platonism is therefore gives the best account of modern science. And much of modern science, like modern physics or whatever, reflects that. So it's not about going, I know some of the people you interview and stuff, I've had a bit of a look around. It's not about going and saying, oh, well, you know, maybe you'd say, oh, you know, you might go to Plato talking about Platonic solids, or the, you know, in the Timaeus and stuff, say, oh, look, we found them and that's actually there, or, you know, the structure of water and things like that. It's not so much about that. It's about saying that, well, this actually gives us the best philosophical account of what we're doing with the mathematics and what we're doing with the empirical science. So that is my view. That's my project. not everyone in the academy. We just love reading the dialogues and all the interesting stuff about politics and stuff a lot of the time. But that's the way I see it. And so I say, well, why do we have these silly accounts of the foundation of mathematics, these silly accounts of Bishop Berkeley's problem, the problem of reference in epistemology? Why do we keep fudging the problem? The answer is political. The answer is this political story of the problems that we had just 2 generations ago when religion was really culturally, politically important. It's not anymore. We can choose what religion we want. We can take or leave the Trinity or whatever. No one's going to burn us at the stake. We probably won't even lose our job.
Things change, society changes, and so on and so forth. And of course, some things don't change, to quote the famous mystical theology of the Matrix.
Okay, I haven't seen that yet. Everyone says I must see it, so I will.
No, I think this was in the 2nd or 3rd whatever episode installment. Anyway, that's very interesting, and I'd like to ask you one more thing, if you have a couple more minutes. You mentioned some point the fact that Platonism comes with this solution that in reality we don't have to dissociate ourselves from the world of objects, that somehow knowledge is interiorized. It's all about my experience of things that makes things, whatever, make some sense to me. By the way, Augustine, whom you love, had this beautiful reference to this interiorizing approach in his Confessions, when he said, in you, my heart or my soul, I measure the time. So even the so-called objective passage of time becomes interiorized. It's a reality that doesn't just flow beside me. It flows through me, and I'm included in the very nature and essence of things. I cannot be dissociated, and this is something that bothers me about, at least the way I understand modern science, where it's all this objectivism, or all the knowledge that you can gather is somehow external to my experience, to our experience. Would Platonism bring a different sense of, or legitimize a different sense of approach to the scientific inquiry, where the subject and the object are no longer dissociated?
Exactly. So if I may just give you a cartoon version, in materialism, what we might call materialist philosophy, you have the observer and the observed. And the essence of the being of the observed object is in itself, and then somehow beyond its observation. So in Platonism, you definitely have objects in the world. We're not denying objects in the world, but you have observer, observed, subject, object, as you say, and at a point, at a very deep point, that collapses. So the object collapses into the observer. Now, really, to come to an understanding of that, a mystical understanding of that, is not something that you're going to come to any of us in any tradition, the Eastern traditions, which teach very similar things to Platonism. You're not going to come to that right away, how that happens and how it could possibly be. I mean, you still have independent objects, right? They still exist and you can still rely on them and all. How does that work? It sounds like a solipsism, right? A solipsism, like I've just have this interior world and I don't know the external world. But in Platonism, the subject and object collapses at this very deep level. So it's a completely different approach. In the painting, Raphael's painting, Plato pointing up, Aristotle down, I would tend to say in the modern world, it really is pointing in. It collapses into the observer. So the observer has the experience, doesn't cause all of its experience. I don't cause all my experience, but it is my experience. I construct those objects in my experience. I don't cause them. I don't cause my cup of tea to get cold. I don't cause them, but I construct them within my experience. I don't know anything else, right? That's all I know. And so when you approach it that way, you have a very different outcome, and you have a very different view of the relationship between mathematics and geometry and the form of your objects. And so that's really where Platonism is very, very different. Now, Doru, I do have the last chapter of this little story, but we can leave it for another, which is the Enlightenment, but we can leave that for another time if you want.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in continuing this conversation, Bernie. Really.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time. All right, okay. Well, then the final, so you have this Renaissance, you have these scientists getting burned at the stake, and you have all this getting involved in theological controversies of all sorts, and you have anti-Trinitarianism emerging again, and it's causing lots of problems. And the Reformation comes along. So there's a particular story in the British experience, and why this is important, because the British made the breakthrough that we now call the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment attitude to science. So this is in the 16th century, the 17th century, 1600s. Now, so they had Henry VIII, as you might know, just whacked on, said, we're going to separate from the Pope, but he loved his incense, and he loved all these rituals,
all the regalia. Yeah,
he loved
he
all
kept the
that
externals.
stuff.
Yep.
And he'd been chasing down the translator of the Bible, and he'd been into English, and he'd been chasing down all those bloody Lutherans and all this. So anyway, you had this introduction of Protestantism, where he's the head of the church. Important that the king was the head of the church. So you had that situation. And then you had the rise of the Puritans. So this is kind of like the Calvinist Lutherans coming through and saying, we've got to reform the church, we've got to even get rid of Christmas, and we've got to knock down all the icons and all that sort of stuff. So they're a very strong movement. And they were very strong in what became the British Civil War in the 1640s. And so, and they killed the king. They killed the king. They killed the king and the head of the church. And what you got in what's called the interregnum in the Latin between kings and the Commonwealth under Cromwell. I mean, I don't expect you to know this history. Some people might know it. Is that you got...
Romanians know a lot of stuff because we were bombarded from the lower high school with universal history was called. So I studied that till late in my undergrad studies. So I know a lot of stuff about Europe,
about the
Asia,
British
Africa.
Experience. Yeah, okay. So, and what you got then was what they called, it's interesting, it's in Plato, enthusiasm, being filled with God, because Plato believed wisdom, and also what the poets, the artists, that actually a knowledge, wisdom comes from God, and it's being from the divine and being filled with God. And actually, we humans don't have any independent wisdom. It's all divine, right? So Plato used this word enthusiasm, and it was used in ancient times to mean this. Well, the derogatory term amongst the elites for these movements that occurred in this interregnum period was enthusiasm. And so it would vary from some madman perhaps saying that he was Jesus and coming into town with a donkey and all the people believing and swarming around him, to some movement like the Quakers, who still exists today. And they were very apocalyptic earlier on, and then they came to have a much deeper mystical teachings, probably not the right word, but experience. So you got all this happening, and it was very destabilizing. It was politically destabilizing. During this time, there was a movement to have science and religion together, to get science coming through together. And you got a chap called Hartlib, he was important in it, that try to introduce in a theocratic, almost theocratic environment. It was the closest Britain came to a theocracy. Theocratic environments have science and religion together. That had problems. That collapsed. The Commonwealth collapsed. And then some of the figures that were involved with him were also involved in another movement. And this was the movement that led to the Royal Society of London getting charter from the restored monarchy from Charles II. Now, they promoted themselves as a remedy for enthusiasm. They promoted themselves as sober and reasonable. They promoted themselves as studying nature. Once again, going back to what was happening with the Middle Ages with Thomas Aquinas, we're going to study material nature that's already been created. We're not going to deal with these other issues. And so all those enthusiasts, right? Platonism is in that category. Platonism, God within, Platonism, all wisdom is divine, not really problematic. So they had to have this propaganda. And so, like you say, when you mentioned Newton, like he was into his astrology, he was into his alchemy, he had 5 furnaces in his little digs at Cambridge and all that sort of thing. He was doing all that stuff, but he wasn't creating the propaganda. A guy called Wilkins was. He connected it with John Locke's philosophy. It was transported over to France, and that became the dogma of science in France, and then in Germany, in Kant's time, and so on. And so this survived. This science was allowed. The scientists were no longer getting burned at the stake. They were no longer threatening the church. And this is the division between religion and science that we grew up in today.
Wow, that's fascinating. It is indeed, and illuminating, and it's important for us to dig this history, dig up the truth, and see all these cultural, political, social mechanisms that led to the formation of the world in which we live. Otherwise, we take things for granted, as most people would. Especially those who work with binaries, you know, either science or faith, either philosophy or science, and so on and so forth, either philosophy or faith.
Yeah, revelation and reason.
Yeah.
Revelation and reason, you know, the division that Aquinas set up, pretty much there, and that just continued right through. And then you have various positions where you have the deists. You have these people called the deists around the time of John Locke, who said, reason can explain everything. We don't need revelation. But it was this materialist, empiricist notion of science. It wasn't the sort of notion of science that I think you and I are more favored towards.
Thank you very much, Bernie. It has been an illuminating conversation, and I hope that the viewers would benefit as much as I did listening to you. Thank you. It has been such a pleasure and a refreshing perspective being brought up to this complex conversation, debate regarding science, faith, thinking, philosophy, and so on and so forth.
Oh, well, thank you so much to you, Doru, and it's been great to talk to you, and wonderful to know that we can have this conversation within the Orthodox circles. I think it's just wonderful, and it's really refreshing for me to be able to do that. And I do want to, I know that you've done a lot of work, and we haven't talked about it here, on early Christian cosmology. And so I'd love to talk more about that and what you've already mentioned about the experience in the Byzantine period in parallel with what was happening with the scholastics in the West. So thank you very much.
Well, hopefully we can catch up again.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Doru.
Thank you.